Uh, my name is Henning Mortensen, and I'm the room host for Room 3. I live up in Canada at Prairie Spruce Commons, housing development up there, and I'm very happy to introduce you to Crystal Byrd. Crystal is going to be doing a talk on funding and support options for BIPOC communities. Crystal is a North Carolina native, active in the co-housing and polyamorous communities. An engineer turned educator, she speaks and writes about ways communities can be more welcoming to people of all kinds of backgrounds. Crystal is the website editor for Black and Poly, an organization promoting healthy polyamorous relationships for people of color. She also serves as a board member with the Foundation for Intentional Communities. Her book, The Token Common Sense Ideas for Increasing Diversity in your organization, is out now. Crystal is passionate about encouraging people to change their perspectives on diversity, relationships, and the world. Welcome, Crystal, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so hi everybody, welcome to my talk. It's the end of the day, so I hope you're not too tired. And I just want to preface that, so I wrote this presentation idea like in February, and it's, you know, October now. And so I was writing with a lot of optimism, but it turns out there's no magic way to get funding for a co-housing community or any kind of intentional community. But I'm going to talk about some of the ways that BIPOC communities have found funding. And so just to clarify, BIPOC means Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So it is kind of a grouping word for non-white people. And I will talk about some of the communities that I've worked with, and then I will open it up for questions. So I'll start by introducing myself a little bit more. Like Henning said, I'm on the board of the Foundation for Intentional Communities. I am a diversity consultant, so I work with a lot of different communities, including co-housing communities, about being more diverse and steps they can take. And then I wrote a book about it, and that book is called The Token. And let me put it in the chat. And I always forget to have a link to it somewhere, but it's available on Amazon. Common Sense Ideas for Increasing Diversity. This book was written with co-housing communities in mind, and it's really short. It's like 118 pages, and it answers that question, why aren't there such and such people in my community? It tries to take people through the process of creating more inclusive communities, understanding the difficulties that people with different identities may face coming into community, and then how you can accommodate that. So that's the book. And the other thing I will be, oh, you have my book, yes.
I have 10 of your books. I read it and I said, ha, I'm going to be this woman's cheerleader because she could live in my community, but she doesn't. But a lot of people here have read your book. I think it's terrific. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm really glad that people are finding it helpful. So that makes me happy. Yeah, so the other thing I'm going to be talking about is the BIPOC Council. So this is a group of people who, it was initially formed from FIC. So FIC kind of created a fund to give money to BIPOC communities. And then the BIPOC Council are people who are identified as BIPOC who want to help that. So that we've taken applications, we've given out money. You know, we're kind of a resource and a network for people who are looking for intentional communities that don't want to rely on FIC, but we're definitely working in concert with FIC too. So the BIPOC Council did a survey last year through FIC, and we were trying to figure out what are the biggest needs that people have when they're trying to join an intentional community, create an intentional community. And, you know, we got all kinds of people in the survey. And this slide kind of breaks down the people who identified as BIPOC, what their responses were. And I'm just going to go ahead and flip to the next page because there's another question that we asked. So the main barrier to moving into an intentional community for these people who responded was financial. And then we asked another question about the barriers to starting, maintaining, and growing an intentional community. And the number one answer for that was financing. So you can see that money, it makes the world go round, and that's just a big problem everywhere. But when it comes to BIPOC, there's an added factor because of the historical marginalization and disinvestment from Black and Indigenous communities that prevent us from having the same type of wealth that a lot of white people go into or have when they're going into intentional communities. So finances is a big thing. We want to find money, we want to find resources for people to be able to build intentional communities. And so what I did is I have gotten a few communities that are doing various models of how to fund a community, and I'm going to tell you about them. And yeah, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, you can raise your hand. I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to answer questions after my presentation. So, and just to go through this, some of the barriers for moving into an intentional community besides finances was culture clash and concerns, hard to find or access, racial diversity concerns, information or support, life logistics, that means like where you're currently living, how soon can you move out of your home, do you have kids, things like that, physical accessibility, and then not being accepted or invited to join a community once they did a visiting period. And then the barriers to starting, maintaining, and growing a community were financing, conflict, poor communication and organization, finding land, racism, COVID, and affordability. And I think if any of y'all are intentional communities, a lot of these are probably the exact same struggles that y'all have come up against. And so I think it's helpful just to know that, everybody who's looking for a community kind of has some of the same barriers to joining an intentional community or creating one. 1 in 10, right? Is that the statistic? 1 in 10 communities that start forming actually make it to being built. All right, so the first example is a community in Olympia, Washington, and this is called Conscious Culture Cooperative. So it's a cooperative housing situation. And what the way that they got their land was that a white person said, hey, I own this land. I'm going to gift it to you to put your community on. And so that can be a form of reparations or land back. So reparations is this idea that marginalized people, specifically Black Americans who were enslaved, had a lot of barriers to accessing the middle class, real American dream lifestyle in the US. And that's a result of slavery and racism and all these things in American culture. And so the idea of reparations is that Black Americans should be compensated in some way. And, when we think about reparations, there's lots of things you can do, but what people advocate for is direct payments and direct restitution. And so if that means giving land or giving money directly to communities that have been affected, that's kind of what we want as reparations. I'm part of the reparations advocacy thing, but it's a whole different kind of argument about what that means and how it should be applied. This land was given to 2 Indigenous women, and they were allowed to, they're allowed to occupy the land right now. They have a 10-year lease, basically rent to own agreement, where they're paying off the cost of the land to the owner over time. And it's kind of like owner financing. So they don't have to worry about banks and mortgages and interest and all that, those kind of things. And so now they have people living on the land. They have joined the BIPOC Council to kind of get more resources on community conflict and how to find members and things like that. But, they've already gotten over that huge hurdle of finding land. And that's because somebody was generous enough to gift that land to them. So when we think about other opportunities for that, there are some things like Soulfire Farms. They have a list of kind of like a reparations farmland of people who are willing to give their farmland to Indigenous or Black people so that they can have the same type of community. And the land back movement is the idea that the land was taken away from Indigenous people in the US, and they should get some of that land back at lower cost, or, you know, without the same risk, and be able to occupy the land like they did, like their ancestors did. All right, the next one you may have heard is called Freedom Georgia. And this is, they had a GoFundMe in 2020, and it was really huge. They were on the news and stuff like this. And so they're also members of the BIPOC Council. But the Freedom Georgia initiative is a really interesting and probably very unique community. So they have about 200 acres down in Georgia. And what they did, they had a GoFundMe to raise money for this land. And so they were able to purchase the land, and now they're raising money to be able to, you know, develop the land and put housing on it. They are organized as an LLC, which I think is pretty interesting. There's 49 members, which means it's a really huge LLC, and, you know, very logistically challenging. But Freedom Georgia used what we call crowdfunding. So GoFundMe is a crowdfunding platform. And they were also taking advantage of kind of the spirit of 2020, where people were very interested in police brutality and anti-racism, and helping BIPOC get more resources. And so I present this as a funding option because even though people don't have that same urgency as, you know, like after the George Floyd protests and stuff, people still care about it. And I think it's a way to help people plug into the movement. So if you're ever thinking, oh my goodness, I've learned all these things about what's happened to Black and Indigenous people, and I want to help. Well, you can help by directly donating money to organizations like Freedom Georgia. Next one, and this one is really, really, it's also interesting to me. I guess all these examples are good examples for me. So this is Freedom Village, and the BIPOC Council specifically is supporting a group called The Grove at Freedom Village. So Freedom Village is also in Georgia. For some reason, a lot of people, a lot of BIPOC want to move to Georgia, but Freedom Village is part of what I would call a Pan-Africanism Black cultural movement, where we're not just building an intentional community that happens to include Black people. It's an intentional community kind of centered around the needs of Black people. And that means it's not just a neighborhood. It's a place where people can work. They're gonna have an internal currency. You know, they're gonna grow their own food and sell the food to raise money. They're building all of the housing units with materials on site. So with mud and the wood that's on the land. They're using this model of investment that I forgot the name of, but you know, it's organized as a way that everybody is buying a share, and then they're all kind of getting the dividends as part of that. And so Freedom Village is not just about we're creating an intentional community. It's more about we're kind of reclaiming this Black culture, and we have some very specific ideas about what that means to be Black, and very specific ideas about how their children should be raised, about how their money should go into the rest of the US and across the world. And the people who are committed to that are buying little plots of land, and then they are building their homes using the building methods that these founders have developed. And then they're moving into the homes. And then once they have moved in, they're now part of what's called, you know, a freedom nation. So their lives are completely interconnected, from their work and their free time to where they get their food and all things like that. So that's a really fascinating model for me. And I think it's something that we don't see a lot in FIC and kind of in the majority white intentional communities movement. What really came to us, or to me, once we started talking to a lot of these BIPOC-led groups, was that there is a whole nother kind of set of people who are forming intentional communities and are doing it out of a sense of survival. You know, it's not just oh, it'd be nice to have a community where I know my neighbors. This is like a survival thing. And that's kind of where Freedom Village lands in, is that we need to do this. We need to teach our children how to work the land. We need to be able to support ourselves. We need to be able to protect ourselves somewhat from the government. And so that's like a whole area out there that nobody, I mean, the FIC at least has not had a lot of visibility to. I haven't seen it in Communities Magazine. And so I'm just really fascinated by that. And I love talking to these groups and understanding their motivations, because I completely get it. But I think it's important to also share that with the world, that there are communities that are going to be like Black and specifically Indigenous, and for those people, because they have this really strong value of supporting their culture. So why Georgia? So when you think about it, Georgia's in the South, and it's kind of a symbol of what was taken from Black people. So you think of Georgia as having a lot of plantations. There were plenty in South Carolina. North Carolina didn't have as many slaves, but there were a lot of plantations and small, and people who owned a couple of slaves in North Carolina and Virginia. But Georgia is kind of like the heart of the South. And when people think about oppression and the things that have happened to Black people over the years, they kind of think of Georgia. So you think about the Martin Luther King Center is in Atlanta. You think about churches that are really popular. You think about Tyler Perry, his studios are in Atlanta. So Black people in Georgia kind of have a relationship, I guess, where people want to move to Georgia. There's also a lot of rural land in Georgia, but it's close enough to Atlanta, for instance, or Aiken, to South Carolina City. So it's close enough to urban places where there are large Black populations that people will feel safe about being in those rural areas. So they can still be connected to kind of that culture, that Black culture, instead of moving out in the middle of Wyoming, for instance, which has a much smaller Black population. So that's my theory about Georgia. I'm not sure exactly why, but we had so many communities that are part of the BIPOC Council. They're like, we want to move to Georgia. And I was like, sure, that's great, sounds great. And then the last one you may have heard of is the East Bay PREC. It's a permanent real estate cooperative. And so the way this cooperative works is that you have people who are residents, you have people who are just like community members, supporters, you have people who are staff of East Bay PREC, and then you have, there's one more category. Residents, investors, community members, and then the staff. And all of these people are members of the co-op. That means they've all paid, or well, okay, if they're living there, working there, they haven't paid, but you invest into the co-op, and then they use the funds from the co-op to buy housing. So what they do is they'll find a community or a housing unit or land, and they'll buy it. And they're taking that property off the speculative market. And then they train people who want to live in that community. They train them on all the cooperative, consensus-based decision-making and how to form a co-op and all these things. And they train them to run it as like an intentional community, instead of just saying, oh, we're taking it off the market and then we're gonna, rent it out to private people. No, we're teaching them how to create a community. And then they can also still get dividends from the rest of the investments that have come into East Bay PREC. So that's a really cool model, because it's more active than just saying, hey, let's wait for people to give us money. No, let's put our own money into it, and then let's invite other investors. I mean, they have millions of dollars. So inviting, people to invest in it as a really stable investment, or, however people deal with investments, and they can get get dividends off it. They can get a return if they want to withdraw their money. And it's very enriching to the communities that they go into. When they find a house and they buy it, suddenly, they can decide what's going to happen to this land, what's going to happen to the community. They can protect it from gentrification. They can protect it from, high housing costs going up. They can, they can kind of decide who lives there and who gets to be the residents there. You know, there's a lot of FHA kind of rules around that, but this is how they are helping to create communities for BIPOC people and to help sustain communities. I think that's the last one. Yeah, okay. So now I'm going to tell you about the BIPOC Council that I've been mentioning. So we were started in 2020, and I'll go ahead and show you the mission. The mission is to cultivate radically safe and inclusive communities for Black, Indigenous, and people of color by providing inspiration, solidarity, and support to those seeking to find or found communities and to those already living in communities. So FIC, again, they started this with the idea we're going to raise money. FIC currently puts 10% of any unrestricted donations towards the BIPOC fund, but they very quickly turned it over. And since I'm a board member and a BIPOC council member, I kind of speak for both, but I'm not like the only person speaking for them. They turned it over to the BIPOC council members to create our own governance system, to decide what are the rules for, you know, communities that are applying, how do we distribute this money, what are we going to do with the money, you know, things like that. And so what we've done, I mean, we spent a whole year talking. We started like in August 2020, and now it's 2021. It was a whole lot of talking and understanding what are the support needs of BIPOC, you know, the people who are already part of this movement, and then people who are interested in it, you know. And what we found is that there are a lot of people who feel left out. You know, they're not coming to these co-housing conferences. They don't know anything about FIC, but they want to form an intentional community, you know, what they think of as intentional communities, which fits in the definition. And there's not that same support. And then another big thing that I can talk about, and I will try not to go into it too much, but, you know, FIC cannot put in its directory that a community is BIPOC majority, or that a community has, you know, certain types of people in it. You know, that's illegal according to the federal government. But there is a need for people when they're looking for a community to say, you know, does this community have any minorities in it? You know, who is in charge of the community? You know, do they have any LGBTQ diversity? You know, any disability representation? And there's just not that. And so the BIPOC Council has decided to try and at least fill the gap for that race and ethnicity question, and to say, okay, here's a community, you know, we're going to put the BIPOC Council's seal of approval on it. And that means that community focuses on the needs of people who are BIPOC people. It supports them, it has their values in mind, and it is committed to anti-racism and anti-oppression. And so those are kind of the guidelines that we have for, you know, for approving a community in our directory. So we're building our own directory. I just submitted the articles of incorporation last week. You know, we're working on bylaws. Eventually, we're going to be our own nonprofit with 501c3 status. And we're also going to have this kind of investor model where people can put their money in, and we use that to fund people who want to join intentional communities, or help people who need some kind of training, or who want to kind of learn more about, you know, how to do intentional communities. You know, so we're making those connections for people, and we're also just being a resource for people who are just out there and like, is there anybody like me? You know, one thing we do is we have monthly support calls. That means that every month, you know, it's a small group of people, they're on Zoom and they're talking about their experience in community, you know, and it's mostly BIPOC. It's close to BIPOC. Two out of every 3 meetings is just for BIPOC to kind of talk about their experiences. And then the third meeting, so once a quarter, there is an open call, and that's where a community will get to present about their community and tell people about what they're doing. And so that's kind of what we set up as the BIPOC Council. We raised $16,000 last year, and we gave almost all of it away in August. So we gave it to 5 communities, and it was a very long application process. And this is where I got a lot of the interesting tidbits that I was telling you earlier. But, you know, we're really excited about going into the next year and raising even more money, and then giving all of that money away. and supporting communities in growing. So, yeah, so the seal approval process would cover co-housing communities. We currently have one co-housing community in the directory. It's a forming community. I think the rest of them are like cooperatives or just land. So I'm going to put the website in the chat. ICC.org. And it's a very small directory right now. So I really want people to like sign in and like add your community, and then we'll like evaluate it. It's not like a huge process. it's really small, you know, we're just learning how to do things like this. But you know, there is that kind of like, we want to make sure that we're representing the community that we're trying to support. FIC is also going to add something in their directory that says this person or this community is a BIPOC council member, right? So there's like 4 of them now that, if I don't even know if this has been implemented yet, but anyway, there's going to be one of those drop downs, you know, just like it says they're an FIC member, it says, oh, they're a BIPOC council member. And that can be another sign to people that we are, or that community is kind of supporting the goals and the needs of BIPOC people. And that was all I put in my presentation. Yeah, so you can ask me questions. I can, yeah, just, does anybody have questions?
Appreciate it. This has been so informative and exciting.
Yes, I'm very excited about it. Yeah, so I've been on the board of FIC for about 2 years now, and it wasn't my idea to come up with the BIPOC Council. In fact, I joined the board saying, I'm not going to be the diversity person. You know, like that's my job in the rest of the world. So FIC, I'm just here to help with everything else. But then, you know, they made this proposal, and I was like, okay, well, I'm jumping over here to help with that now. And so it's been really great to meet a whole different group of people who are interested in intentional communities. And they, like I said, they don't show up to these type of events just because they don't feel safe. They don't feel like they'll be seen here. And so it's really nice to have a space for them to come and feel comfortable.
Yeah, that's a question that I have, I guess, which is like, what are some immediate, easy things, doable things? I mean, easy in terms of like cutting effort, but I mean, like what can I do to make it more inviting for people of color in the BIPOC community?
I think one thing that might be easy is to figure out the new language and understand how different terms can be used or misused. So okay, so language changes all the time, and then you have kind of like this social justice way of like calling people out when they misuse language. So I'm not advocating that you learn it in a sense of fear. I'm advocating that you learn it just so that you can show respect to people who want these terms. Like BIPOC is fairly new, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So you want to understand that people want to be called Black, they want to be called Indigenous instead of Native American. People of color is kind of like a catch-all term, but people would much rather be referred to by their ethnicity, you know, or the country they came from, things like that. So it's okay to say those words and say, you know, use things that mean like what their ethnicity is in the appropriate way. So finding out those terms and then understanding what microaggressions are. So I do a whole course, I guess, on like different small, and they're really, really small. Microaggressions are just really unintentional ways of harming people. But when you speak to people and they're new and you're new to them and you see something different about them, it's natural to want to ask about that. But it doesn't really make the other person comfortable. So if I'm Black and I walk into a room full of white people and somebody makes the comment like, asking, for instance, if I'm from Georgia, which has been asked before, or talking about my hair, you know, that's immediately like, okay, they're seeing me as this Black person. They're not seeing me as me. And that kind of makes me feel like, oh, I don't want to be here. So, you know, trying to find those shared things that you can talk about without, you know, kind of putting the person on the spot. So don't talk about their accent, their name, you know, any kind of physical characteristics, any visible disabilities that you see, you know, don't do any of that. Say like, you know, if we're at a co-housing conference, for instance, you know, how do you like, where are we going to be next year? Michigan? Madison. Yeah. So
Yeah.
how do you like Madison? What do you think about the weather here? Things like that. You know, the weather, sports, things. So people can feel comfortable without you making it an interrogation about their identity. So those are two of the things that you can do, just the language and then microaggressions. And then there's a whole bunch of kind of anti-racism stuff. There's, you know, what I call the anti-racism bestseller list, you know, Robin DiAngelo, Ibram Kendi, you know, there are lots of books about these things that people can read, or maybe they can just buy and not read. My book is really short, so it can be a good read, and it's specific to kind of co-housing and those type of communities too. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
That's great. Thank you.
Crystal, what you were saying about microaggressions really is, I think, important. And people may be able to relate to it if they think about school bullying, or when you were going through school and, you know, wanting to make new friends, but then having sort of sometimes the experience of feeling excluded from different social groups. That seems to cross all racial and gender and other boundaries, and people can understand that.
Well, I have a question.
Okay.
I live in Minneapolis, St. Paul area. It's a, you know, big metro. I think it's 3 million, 7-county area. And it's really racially segregated. And we came onto the world stage with George Floyd's killing. And yeah. So we're like deeply white progressives are deeply into their white work and reading, you know, you're talking about the anti-racism bestseller list, like, yep. We also had an anthology in Minnesota, A Good Time for the Truth. And it's these essays, each one by a different person, about the experience of living within Minnesota. And it's not only Black people, there are people who are mixed race, who are Asian. We have a large Hmong community here, Southeast Asian people origin. Really painful to read, informative to read, like so important. And so I'm on the board of the Twin Cities Co-Housing Network. It's a 501c3. And pretty much since we started the organization, and so far it's just pretty much been white people who have come to everything and on the board. And similar to the question that Brian had asked, and through some volunteering that I've done with this, a Black-led group that's urban agriculture here, kind of like a baby steps learning, like our fortunes collectively are together, and approaching work with a spirit like, my fate is bound with yours. How can we work together toward this? You know, I'm going to be trite and say the beloved community, but I mean, it's got a lot of meaning there. Martin Luther King, you know, sets some narratives for us to aspire to. So I just thought I'd share that.
Yeah, a couple years ago, I gave a presentation about housing segregation, and that's actually probably my favorite topic to talk about. So, you know, it doesn't matter what city you go into, there's going to be these huge lines about where people live and where it's okay to move into. And even when we talk about banking and financing and stuff like that, there's still some discrimination that happens. And so that's going to be a fact if you're building a community, or you're thinking about inviting people to your community. You know, I live in what is a majority Black neighborhood, and it's kind of like, it was intentionally majority Black, and we want it to stay majority Black. And so, you know, it's kind of complicated, because no, I don't want to be like discriminatory or say, you know, I don't want these people in my neighborhood, but, you know, our neighborhood has a culture and has an identity and in history, and that's important, and that's something we want to preserve. And so when you think about creating a co-housing community or an intentional community, you have to think about the spaces that you are going into and what identity have those spaces already had. So, okay. Diane asked, what community do I live in and what has been my experience? So I don't live in intentional community right now. I just come to all these co-housing conferences. Why? Because I like the co-housing people. But I initially got into this in about 2014, 2015. I started I was part of a forming group in Charlotte, North Carolina for co-housing. And so that community or that group, you know, struggled a lot, not just because of housing segregation, but also just because of this diversity issue. I mean, white and Black people in Charlotte, I'll just say in my experience, have really huge differing cultures and ways of being here in the South. And so it was difficult for me to feel like I could continue supporting the formation of that community. Now, I still do have like the web domain and the email address. So I am like the Charlotte co-housing admin person, but it's really just me helping other people in the area to find each other and to work on their community. So, so yeah, I haven't lived in an intentional community yet. I've, you know, visited a lot of communities. I've done these conferences when they were in person and visited places. And I've talked to a lot of people about their communities and their experiences. So it's been really nice to learn and then to be able to share some of those learnings with people.
Can I follow up with that?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, you know, I am interested to hear if, I mean, obviously there's so much, you know, white people need to do, but if you're in a majority white co-housing community, do you have any thoughts about how to make it a more welcoming community for people of color? And, you know, I know that's sounds naive and is very simplified, but still I'm open to what you have to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what I wrote my book about. So it's possible, but what has been clear is that it's an ongoing challenge, and the communities that I've talked to about it, there's often been already harm for the people who, you know, were in those communities and they didn't feel like they were accepted. And so I think it's important for communities to kind of be really reflective on who they are, what their values are. You know, the most common thing that comes up when we talk about these issues of diversity is that a lot of white people don't think of themselves as white. And they also think of themselves as very inclusive and welcoming already. And my job is to say, hey, you're a wonderful person, you have the best intentions, but you're still doing things wrong. And just because you're really nice, it doesn't mean that you're creating a safe space for people. And so that's kind of like really like it's internal work, and it takes a long time, and you really have to wrestle with it. And you have to figure out for yourself, and then you have to go talk to all the other community members and say, hey, this is what I learned. So now you got to kind of go through this process too. And so it's kind of like this really slow, just kind of like wave of knowledge for people. And so the best way, I don't know if there's a best way, but a good way to do it is just to introduce these concepts to your community and say, we're not doing this because we're bad people, we're doing it because this is what people have said will help them feel better about being in a community. So it's like, if people have left a community because maybe they felt like their culture wasn't respected, or they felt like them as a person was being disrespected, then you can look into microaggressions and you can look into cultural appropriation. So we talked about microaggressions before. Cultural appropriation is this thing that people do when they kind of take on another characteristics of another culture and kind of use those. And it's using them in a way that doesn't honor the people or the culture that it came from. And so the really controversial example that I love giving is yoga, right? So a lot of people in the US do yoga now, and that was taken out of its context in India of the religious practice, the spiritual practice of the whole whatever, you know, the history that came with it. And it was thrown and has become an exercise program and, you know, a mindfulness thing. And so that's something, that's an example of cultural appropriation, in that if someone who maybe was in India and came here and they saw people doing yoga or using their own, you know, things like that, when they see that, they may feel disrespected. I'm not going to speak for everybody. Some people will feel disrespected and they feel like these people are not going to honor who I am if they're using this part of my culture in this way. The other example of cultural appropriation is all of pop music. And you think about how pop music has used the gospel singing and rhythm and blues, which was created by Black people. And now white people are using that style of music and they're becoming really wealthy off of it without acknowledging the contributions of Motown and the blues musicians who, you know, lived in poverty and, you know, didn't become very famous, but these other people are becoming very famous. So when we think about that, when we think about how somebody of that culture will feel when they're showing up in a space and something like that is done. And those are two like really broad examples that probably are not gonna, like, you asked a random Black person what they think of pop music and be like, I don't care. You know, but there are smaller bits of that, you know, that when it happens, it just kind of rubs up against you and just like, I don't like that. And then when you're constantly experiencing that, you're like, this community is just not for me. Mapping prejudice. So if you haven't seen this racial dot map, you need to see a racial dot map. This is a dot for every, this was 2010 census, so it's a little old, but this shows, you can zoom into your, you can't go down to like house level, but maybe like large neighborhood level. And you can see the dots, and it has a dot for Asian, Hispanic, or Latino, African-American, and white. I think those are the only 4 categories, but you can see kind of like, you'll see as roads pass through, you'll see like groupings of people, and it shows that housing segregation was definitely intentional. You know, it may have not been malicious, but it was intentional. And that was, if you haven't read the book, The Color of Law, that talks about the history of housing segregation. So I got distracted and I didn't read the rest of your comment. Yes, and so if you have a house that was built like in the maybe 40s, 50s, you may have a covenant on there that says this house cannot be sold to a non-white person. And that's really shocking, but it's what happened. You think about the subdivisions and the suburbs and how they were built. Those were almost exclusively white places, and you know, the bank would not finance Black people and minority people moving into those suburbs. So that's really, really fascinating history for me. April Lonnie, hi. Selective marking.
Hi.
So you're
And
saying
also not to run up against laws, segregation and discrimination laws. Thanks.
so it's really easy. You just have to be a little sneaky about it, and not sneaky like lying to people, but you really do have to say, you know, this is a community that has these values and this is the history of it, this is the culture of it. You know, I tell white communities all the time they should, you know, make sure their stock photos are showing diversity. Well, make sure, you know, your website is talking, you know, is maybe using terms from, you know, your language that, you know, that kind of are familiar to some people and not to others. Pictures of places that are like evoke memories or something. Like if I were advertising to people in my local neighborhood, you know, I would use, what would I use? I would use the picture of a ram or the colors blue and yellow because there was the historically Black high school that was their mascot, you know, and something that evokes that kind of memory for those people. And it's something that signals, you know, we know what your history is, we know who you are, and this community is gonna celebrate who you are. So it's not being sneaky, it's just being really transparent and really like throwing it in their face. Like, this is our culture, this is who we are, this is our history. And we want people like that. And that's not to say that white people or people outside of that won't be attracted to it. They might be attracted to it, but it's also going to be a lot more. If you're speaking the language of the people who you want, then it's going to be easier for them to find it.
Thanks, Crystal. I'm in Hawaii and so many people want to move here. We get tens of thousands a year that move here. And so I feel like my job is to partly, weed out a lot of those wannabe Hawaii people. They think it's a perpetual vacation here. It's not. Life is hard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll share one thing actually. I got somebody mentioned the Tulsa massacre in the comments, and we're doing a co-housing project in Tulsa right now, and it's under construction, Harwood Commons. And this was an active conversation all the way through the process for sure, right? And I don't know that they ever came to a place where they're like, oh yeah, we figured it all out and it's fine. But one of the guys I met there was Greg Robinson, who ran for mayor. Brilliant dude, grew up in Greenwood, and just really amazing guy. And I had this really interesting conversation with him where like the local architect, Molly Jones, who we're working with, who's really great, connected us because she thought like maybe co-housing might have something to do with what could help the Black community in Tulsa. And I could tell, like talking to Greg, his first like thought was like, okay, I got to listen to this like white dude tell me stuff, and I was like, I mean, I like maybe some, right? But then also I was like, look, at its worst, co-housing is just a bunch of well-meaning white folks who had enough money to buy an extra house and hang out in that too. Like, that's not really what we're shooting for here. And I was like, well, Greg, like what co-housing has to do with your community is like the whole tenet of the thing is you go to the people you're trying to serve and you ask them what they need, and then you do that thing. Like, to me, that's like the heart of this. And like, that's kind of been my biggest takeaway is like, you just go to people and find out what they need and then see if you can serve that, like, and just do your best. And I think that really flips things around, because historically, like most of us in the forming co-housing groups are trying to get people to come to you where you're at. And it's harder to expect that of people, I think.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's like you're recruiting people and they're like, well, why would I want to leave this place that I'm already in and have established community and stuff? And so, yeah, I think that's a really good way to think of it, about like, why don't we just go to the people and do what these people need? So I have like this probably 10-year-long guerrilla effort in my local community to put all of our houses in land trust, So I know several people and, lots of homeowners here, and the homeowners are dying off because, they bought these in the 60s and 70s, and they were Black, and, now they're dying off, and, their kids are not in this area anymore. They've left and gone to more prosperous areas. And so landlords and, developers are buying up this property. But if we put all these houses in land trust, and the people who are still here can kind of like preserve that community, keep those housing prices low. So that's my guerrilla effort in my community. No white saviors, yes. Are there any other questions?
That was awesome. Thank you, Crystal.
Yes, thank you, Crystal.
So good. And is your book available on Amazon or other places where the money goes more directly? And
okay, let me find. You can go through the publisher, and that's probably like the most direct way to do it. But I still get royalties from Amazon.
Okay. So on your website, do you have your speaker fee for when we can travel more again?
So I don't have speaker fees because honestly, I'm still figuring out how much to charge people, but I will write a proposal and ask you for money if you want me to come and talk to your community or do some consulting or something like that.
Well, I mean, even just to have, I mean, not just, like, I think it would be awesome to have a book, a book talk, an author talk, and then perhaps have discussion and specifically, invite whatever communities might be attracted to hearing you. And just see what happens, like what comes up. We're going to have to sit on our hands and be quiet on the side,
Oof, okay, yeah, I'll say the event tomorrow is kind of like that, where it is just like okay, first listen to a lot of BIPOC talk about their experiences, and then go into a breakout room and discuss it and have your reactions to it. And I definitely
tomorrow.
Oh, it's on FIC's website. It's called BIPOC Members Speak. So I think if you go to ic.org/events, it'll be there. And that's going to try and spin off into kind of a quarterly conversation that communities can, or people, individuals can join into. So if a community wants to do it, they can have it, for their community. But, it'll be like, okay, let's check in and talk about, what kind of work are we doing? What kind of work can we do? Things like that. So
yeah, that's cool. So we could try to publicize it broadly through Facebook or whatever. Cool. Yeah. Both Minneapolis and St. Paul have like municipal cable TV channels where they have studios, and there's programs produced there, and it's gone from it used to be in the old days. It's become a really strong community focused thing where there's a lot of training and access to the equipment, and as long as someone is producing stuff for that, then they can maybe use some of the footage for their own projects, and I think it's great.
that sounds really cool. I've done a lot of like podcasts and interviews on the radio, like local local NPR stations. I haven't done public television. I'm still trying to get my local library. They have my book, but I'm trying to do like an altar event at my local library. But yeah, that's kind of like in the promotion world, and I'm just terrible at promoting myself. So
If you want to make Ann Arbor your local library, I can help you.
Yeah. So that's one thing we can all do is help promote Crystal.
yes.
Well, and sometimes the Friends of the Library group associated with a library has another perspective. It's a little more accessible. So that's something that around here anyway, they sometimes will promote an author event.
Thank you for your promotion idea. But yeah, no, FIC has been great doing a lot of events specifically focused around BIPOC and inclusion, and not just having me talk all the time. So yeah, definitely follow them. If you haven't plugged into FIC, they have their own kind of things going on too.
Thank you.
Crystal, I have a request. How
Okay.
about FIC providing some kind of programming on bystander intervention?
I think you're in luck. So I'm working with them on the courses and like workshops for next year. And I want to specifically do one about kind of like calling in, calling out, and
Thank you.
being an ally. So yeah.
Thank you. We could really use that, and I have a hunch a lot of us could. Yeah, thanks.
And I could imagine that there could be like a whole series, like bystander intervention at work. And that work could be broken down into like corporate, small business, government positions. I mean, it takes a different tack depending on where you are. Like planners do not know a lot. They need more, and it would be good.
My observation is that there's already I shouldn't say quite a bit, but most of what's out there is around corporations, and I'm looking for something for Cohousing because I don't want the corporate model here. I want something that works specifically for us.
I want to thank you again, Crystal, and if you guys want to carry on the conversation, maybe there's an open discussion in there somewhere.
All right, thank you all for listening and engaging. So.
Yeah. And thanks, Henning, for volunteering.
Yeah,
It's cool.
thanks.